Last October, I decided to take my 6-year-old daughter Emily apple picking. It's become a tradition for us since my wife passed away 2 years ago. I always try to find new places to create fresh memories with Emily, so this time I chose a small family-owned orchard about an hour's drive from our home in rural Pennsylvania. The day started perfectly. The weather was crisp, with that distinct autumn chill in the air. Emily was bouncing with excitement in the back seat, chattering about all the apple pies and cider we'd make. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot, I noticed only a handful of cars. Perfect, I thought. We'd have the place mostly to ourselves. The orchard was beautiful. Rows upon rows of apple trees stretched out before us, their branches heavy with ripe fruit. The leaves had just started to turn, creating a patchwork of green, yellow, and red. Emily squealed with delight as I handed her a small basket, and we set off down one of the rows. We'd been picking for about 20 minutes when I first noticed the truck. It was an old beat-up Ford, probably from the 80s, slowly cruising down a parallel row. I didn't think much of it at first, probably just another picker or maybe an employee checking on things. But then I noticed it again, and again, always in the row next to us, always moving at the same slow pace. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Emily was having so much fun, I didn't want to spoil it with my paranoia. As we moved deeper into the orchard, the rows became denser, the trees older and more gnarled. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. That's when I saw him clearly for the first time. The truck had stopped about 20 feet away from us. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lanky, wearing a dirty work coat that had seen better days. His face was weathered with a scraggly gray beard, but it was his eyes that made my skin crawl. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and they seemed to look right through me. He raised a hand in a half wave and started walking towards us. Emily, oblivious to my growing unease, was reaching for a particularly high apple. "Beautiful day for picking," the man called out, his voice rough like gravel. "Need any help there, little lady?" Before I could respond, Emily turned and smiled at him. "No, thank you. My daddy's tall enough to reach the high ones." I instinctively stepped between Emily and the stranger. "We're doing just fine, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you work here?" He nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. It didn't reach his eyes. "Oh yeah. Been here for years. Know every tree in this orchard like the back of my hand." Something about the way he said it made my hair stand on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying, but I had no proof. I just knew I wanted to get Emily away from him as quickly as possible. "Well, we appreciate the offer, but we should be moving on. Lots more apples to pick," I said, gently guiding Emily further down the row. As we walked away, I could feel his eyes boring into my back. I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder, instead focusing on Emily's excited chatter about the different apple varieties. For the next hour, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but every time I relaxed, I'd catch a glimpse of that old truck in the distance or hear the crunch of tires on fallen leaves. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if he caught up to us. I suggested we head back to the farm stand to pay for our apples and maybe get some cider. Emily pouted a bit, but agreed when I promised we could pick pumpkins afterward. As we made our way back through the orchard, I kept a vigilant eye out for the truck or its driver. Just as I thought we were in the clear, I heard the rumble of an engine behind us. I turned to see the truck idling at the end of our row. The man was leaning out the window, those pale eyes fixed on us. "Leaving so soon?" he called out, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "But there's so much more to see deeper in the orchard. Special apples back there, sweeter than anything you've ever tasted." Emily perked up at this, but I tightened my grip on her hand. "Maybe next time," I said firmly, quickening our pace. We finally made it back to the farm stand, and I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw other families milling about. I kept Emily close as we paid for our apples, my eyes constantly scanning for any sign of the man in the dirty work coat. As the cashier was bagging our apples, I casually asked, "Hey, I was wondering about one of your employees. Older guy, drives an old Ford truck." The young woman behind the counter furrowed her brow. That's strange. We don't have any employees that fit that description, and no one's scheduled to work the orchard today. It's all self-pick. My blood ran cold. I mumbled something about must have been mistaken, grabbed our bag and hurried Emily to the car. As I buckled her in, I scanned the parking lot. No sign of the old truck. I peeled out of there as fast as I safely could, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That night, after Emily was in bed, I called the orchard. The owner confirmed what the cashier had said. No employees matching that description, and certainly no one authorized to drive through the orchard. He seemed concerned and said he'd look into it, but I had a sinking feeling nothing would come of it. I tried to put the incident out of my mind, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination. But a few days later, Emily came home from school with a drawing. It was a crude crayon sketch of apple trees, and behind them, partially hidden, was a tall figure with pale blue dots for eyes. "Who's that, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The apple man," she said matter-of-factly. "He's always watching us, Daddy, even when we can't see him." Since then, Emily's drawings have become a constant source of dread. The apple man appears in nearly all of them, always lurking in the background, always watching. I've tried talking to her about it, but she just shrugs and says he's always been there, even before our trip to the orchard. I don't know what to make of it all. Was the man at the orchard real, or some kind of shared hallucination? And why does Emily keep drawing him? I've thought about moving, about seeking professional help, but part of me is terrified of what we might uncover if we start digging deeper. For now, I keep the curtains drawn at night and double-check the locks before bed. And every time I see an old Ford truck on the road, my heart races, and I find myself searching for those pale, empty eyes in the driver's seat. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. It all started this past September when I decided to get back into shape. I'd let myself go over the summer, indulging in too many barbecues and lazy weekends. With fall approaching, I figured it was the perfect time to start a new routine. The local park, just a few blocks from my apartment, seemed like the ideal spot for morning jogs. The first few weeks were pretty uneventful. I'd drag myself out of bed at 5:30 a.m., throw on some running gear, and head out just as the sun was starting to peek over the horizon. The park was beautiful in the early morning light, with mist rising off the river that cut through its center. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. It was peaceful, almost eerily quiet, with only the occasional chirp of early birds and the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the path. It was during my third week of running that I first noticed her. I was about halfway through my usual route when I saw a figure standing by the river's edge. At first, I thought it was just another early morning jogger taking a breather. But as I got closer, I realized the woman wasn't dressed for exercise. She wore a long, dark coat that seemed to blend into the shadows around her. Her hair was long and unkempt, hanging in damp strands around her face. What really struck me, though, was her stillness. She stood completely motionless, staring out at the water. I slowed my pace as I passed her, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Her eyes never moved, never blinked. It was as if she was in some kind of trance. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I finished my run, chalking it up to an odd encounter. But the next day, she was there again. Same spot, same stance, same unwavering gaze fixed on the river. And the day after that, and the day after that. For 2 weeks straight, every single morning, I'd see her in that exact same position. I started timing my runs, and realized she was always there, regardless of whether I passed by at 6:05 or 6:20. It was as if she never left. I began to dread that part of my route. I'd find myself speeding up as I approached her spot, my heart racing not from exertion, but from a growing sense of fear. I couldn't explain it, but something about her presence felt wrong, almost threatening. One particularly foggy morning, I almost convinced myself to skip my run, but I pushed through, determined not to let this strange woman disrupt my routine. As I approached the usual spot, I squinted through the mist, half expecting, half hoping she wouldn't be there. She wasn't. For a moment I felt relief wash over me, but then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, leading away from the river's edge, were footprints. Muddy, wet footprints that seemed to follow the exact path of my usual route. They weren't my prints. I always ran on the paved path, and these were clearly coming from the muddy bank of the river. But they shadowed my route perfectly, as if someone had been following just a few steps behind me, unseen in the fog. I stood there, frozen, staring at those footprints. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had she been following me all this time? How had I not noticed? And where was she now? A twig snapped somewhere in the mist behind me, and I bolted. I ran faster than I ever had before, not daring to look back, convinced that if I did, I'd see her right behind me, reaching out with pale, dripping hands. I didn't stop running until I was back in my apartment, door locked, blinds drawn. I spent the rest of the day jumping at every little sound, peering out my windows, half expecting to see her standing on the street below, staring up at me with those unblinking eyes. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to go back to the park. When I finally did, I decided to change up my route, avoiding the riverside path altogether. As I jogged along a different trail, I ran into Mark, another regular I'd seen around the park. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. I casually asked if he'd seen anything strange by the river lately. His face went pale. He told me he'd seen her too, the woman in the dark coat, always in the same spot. He'd also noticed weird things happening during his runs. Keys going missing, only to turn up in odd places. The feeling of being watched. Cold spots on the trail where the temperature would suddenly drop for no reason. Over the next few days, I talked to more runners. Almost everyone had a story. Some had seen the woman. Others had experienced unexplained phenomena. A few admitted they'd stopped running in the park altogether, too freaked out by the weird vibe. The park grew quieter. Where once there had been dozens of joggers every morning, now I'd be lucky to see 1 or 2. The usual sounds of sneakers on pavement and cheerful good mornings were replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the ever-present gurgle of the river. It was a week later when everything came to a head. I was just finishing up my run, taking a new path that led me closer to the river than I'd been in days. That's when I saw the commotion. Police cars, an ambulance, and a large crowd gathered at the river's edge. I joined the onlookers, my curiosity overcoming my fear. The whispers around me filled in the horrifying details. A car had been found submerged in the river, not far from where the woman always stood. Inside was a body. A woman, they said, who had been missing for months. As they pulled the car from the water, I caught a glimpse of long, dark hair plastered against the driver's side window. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. But as they opened the door and carefully extracted the body, I saw the unmistakable dark coat, now heavy with river water. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and news reports. The woman had been identified as a local resident who had disappeared late last spring. Her car had gone off the road and into the river, unnoticed until now. The current theory was that she had swerved to avoid an animal and lost control, but I knew there was more to the story. How could she have been in that car for months when so many of us had seen her standing by the river? What about the footprints? The strange occurrences? None of it made sense. The park is empty now. Nobody runs there anymore. The trails that once echoed with the sound of joggers are silent, overgrown. Sometimes, when I look out my window in the early morning, I think I see a figure standing by the river's edge. But I don't go to check. I don't run anymore. I never thought working at a produce stand would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life. It all started last summer when I took a weekend job at the local farmers market in my small town just outside of Boise, Idaho. I needed some extra cash for college, and the laid-back atmosphere seemed perfect. Little did I know what was lurking behind the innocent facade of fresh vegetables and friendly faces. The stand I worked at specialized in seasonal produce. everything from crisp apples in the fall to juicy tomatoes in the summer. My boss, an older gentleman named Earl, was easygoing and trusted me to run things on my own. I'd arrive early on Saturday and Sunday mornings to set up the displays, work through the bustling market hours, and close up shop in the evenings. At first, everything was great. I enjoyed chatting with the regulars and soaking up the vibrant energy of the market, but about a month into the job, I started noticing something odd. There was this man who would show up right at closing time, every single weekend without fail. He looked to be in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and a slight paunch. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, but something in his eyes made me uneasy. He'd always make small talk as he perused our remaining produce, asking about my studies and commenting on the weather. Then, like clockwork, he'd invite me to come see his special pumpkins in his truck. The first time it happened, I politely declined, saying I needed to finish closing up. He seemed disappointed but didn't push the issue. The next weekend, he was back again with the same routine. This time he was more insistent about showing me his pumpkins. "You won't believe how big they've grown," he said with an unsettling gleam in his eye. "I've been working on a new fertilizer blend. Just come take a quick look. It'll only take a minute." I felt a chill run down my spine as I made up an excuse about needing to count the cash drawer. He lingered for a few more minutes before finally leaving, but not without casting a long look over his shoulder as he walked away. This pattern continued for weeks. Each time his invitations became more forceful and his demeanor more agitated when I refused. I started dreading the end of my shifts, knowing he'd be there waiting. I considered telling Earl about it, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or cause any trouble. After all, the guy hadn't actually done anything wrong. He was just a bit creepy. One particularly busy Sunday in late September, I was rushing to close up when I realized I'd forgotten to restock some items from our storage area. As I hurried to the back of the stand, I noticed something strange. There was a small gap in the wooden slats that I'd never seen before. It looked like someone had pried one of the boards loose, creating a tiny peephole. My heart racing, I peered through the gap. It offered a perfect view of the register area where I spent most of my time during the day. A sick feeling washed over me as I realized someone could have been watching me for weeks without my knowledge. I quickly finished my tasks, my mind reeling. As I was locking up, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Evening, sweetheart. How about those pumpkins now?" I spun around to see the man standing much closer than usual, his truck idling nearby. In that moment, all my pent-up fear and frustration boiled over. "Look, I'm not interested in your pumpkins, okay? Please just leave me alone." His face darkened, and for a second I thought he might lash out. But then he plastered on a fake smile and said, "No need to get upset. I'll see you next week." He climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving me shaken. The following Saturday, I arrived early, determined to investigate the peephole further. As I was examining the loose board, my hand brushed against something wedged behind it. My blood ran cold as I pulled out a small digital camera. With trembling fingers, I turned it on and began scrolling through the photos. My stomach lurched as I saw dozens of pictures of myself working at the stand. Some were from angles that could only have been taken from the cornfield behind us. There were even a few shots through the windows of my car as I was arriving or leaving work. In a panic, I shoved the camera into my bag and tried to calm myself down enough to work my shift. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every customer that approached the stand made me jump. I kept glancing at the cornfield, imagining eyes peering out from between the stalks. When my boss stopped by to check on things, I finally broke down and told him everything. About the creepy man, the peephole, and the camera. Earl's face grew serious as he listened. He immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes. As I recounted my story to the officers, their expressions grew increasingly grim. One of them pulled Earl aside for a private conversation. When they returned, Earl looked pale. "Listen, kiddo," he said gently. "The police have had similar reports from other stands in the area. They think this might be connected to some missing persons cases they've been investigating." My mind reeled as the implications sank in. How close had I come to becoming another statistic? The police took my statement and the camera as evidence. They assured me they'd increase patrols in the area and asked me to call immediately if I saw the man again. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't seen the creepy man since, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there watching and waiting. Earl insisted on walking me to my car after every shift now, and we've installed security cameras around the stand. The produce stand doesn't feel like the carefree summer job it once was. Every customer interaction is tinged with suspicion. Every rustle from the cornfield sends my heart racing. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if those special pumpkins were ever real or just a sinister ploy to lure unsuspecting victims. As the autumn chill settles in and the market season winds down, I can't help but count the days until I can leave this job behind. But a part of me knows that the fear and unease will linger long after the last pumpkin is sold. The innocence of that small-town farmer's market is gone forever, replaced by the knowledge that sometimes the most ordinary places can hide the darkest secrets. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Boise, Idaho, when I decided to tackle the mountain of leaves in my backyard. I'd been putting it off for weeks, but with Thanksgiving around the corner and family coming to visit, I couldn't delay any longer. Armed with my trusty rake and a stack of lawn bags, I set to work. The repetitive motion of raking was almost meditative, and I found myself lost in thought about the upcoming holiday plans. That's when I noticed something peculiar among the leaves, a flash of glossy paper that didn't belong. Curious, I bent down to investigate and found myself holding an old photograph. At first glance, it seemed like a typical snapshot of a suburban home, my home to be exact. But as I examined it closer, a chill ran down my spine. There, in the upstairs window, was a shadowy figure staring out at the camera. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I told myself it must be a photo from the previous owners, maybe left behind when they moved out. But as I continued raking, more photos emerged from the sea of leaves. Each one featured my house from different angles, always with that same unsettling figure in the window. My hands trembled as I gathered them, the pit in my stomach growing with each new discovery. It wasn't until I found a photo showing my car in the driveway that true panic set in. This wasn't some old relic from previous residents. These photos were recent. Someone had been watching my house, watching me, and for some reason decided to scatter the evidence across my yard. I abandoned the rake and rushed inside, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to call the police, but what would I tell them? That someone had been taking creepy photos of my house and then mysteriously left them in my yard? It sounded absurd, even to me. As I paced my living room trying to calm my nerves and figure out what to do, my phone buzzed with a text. It was my neighbor Jim asking if I'd seen anything strange lately. With shaking hands, I called him back. Jim's voice was tense as he explained that his security camera had picked up some unusual activity over the past week. He'd been meaning to tell me but hadn't wanted to worry me unnecessarily. Now, hearing about the photos, he felt he had to share what he'd seen. According to Jim, his camera had captured movement around my windows several nights in a row, always around 3 a.m. He'd assumed it was just shadows from passing cars, or maybe an animal, but now it seemed far more sinister. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert, jumping at every sound and constantly peeking out the windows. As night fell, I double and triple checked every lock in the house. Sleep was out of the question. How could I possibly close my eyes knowing someone might be out there watching? Around 2:30 a.m., I stationed myself by the upstairs window with a flashlight and my phone, ready to call 911 at the first sign of movement. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slow, each rustle of leaves in the wind sending my heart racing. At precisely 3 a.m., I saw it, a shadow moving across my front lawn. I fumbled with my phone, my fingers feeling thick and clumsy as I tried to dial. But before I could hit call, something made me pause. The figure wasn't approaching the house, it was heading towards the street. Curiosity overrode my fear, and I crept downstairs to get a better look. Peering through the peephole of my front door, I saw a hunched figure shuffling down my driveway. In the dim glow of the streetlights, I could make out what looked like a camera in their hands. Without thinking, I flung open the door and shouted, "Hey, stop right there!" The figure froze, then slowly turned around. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Oh dear," she said, her voice quavering. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you." As it turned out, Mrs. Thompson had been suffering from increasingly severe dementia. Her late-night wanderings had gone unnoticed by her caretaker, who slept soundly through the night. In her confused state, she'd fixate on certain houses, convinced they belonged to long-lost family members. She'd been taking photos, believing she was documenting her family's homes for a scrapbook. When she realized her mistake, she'd try to get rid of the evidence by scattering the photos, too embarrassed to admit her confusion. The police were called not to arrest anyone, but to ensure Mrs. Thompson got the care she needed. Her family was notified, and arrangements were made for round-the-clock supervision. As for me, the fear and paranoia slowly faded, replaced by a mix of relief and sadness. The mystery was solved, but not in any way I could have anticipated. I found myself checking in on Mrs. Thompson regularly, making sure she was okay and had everything she needed. The incident served as a stark reminder that sometimes the most frightening things have surprisingly ordinary explanations. It also taught me the importance of knowing and looking out for your neighbors, especially the vulnerable ones. The shadowy figure in the window wasn't a malevolent stalker, but a confused old woman who needed help. I still have those photos, tucked away in a drawer. Sometimes I take them out, a tangible reminder of those terrifying days and sleepless nights. But now, instead of fear, they evoke a sense of compassion and a renewed appreciation for the unexpected ways our lives can intersect with others in our community. I've always been an avid hiker, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Matthew's Trail last fall. It was supposed to be a simple day hike in the Appalachians of North Carolina. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one was different. The trail started off easy enough. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs as I made my way through the colorful foliage. I'd planned to be back before sunset, but as the day wore on, I realized I'd underestimated the trail's difficulty. The path became increasingly overgrown, and I found myself having to push through thick underbrush. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The trail markers seemed to disappear, and the forest around me grew denser. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal. Panic started to creep in as I realized I was lost. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness fell. I fumbled in my backpack for my flashlight, cursing myself for not being better prepared. That's when I saw it, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was a ranger station or another hiker's campsite. I pushed through the undergrowth towards the light, my heart pounding. As I got closer, I saw it was coming from a small rustic cabin. It looked old, really old, like something out of a pioneer story, but at that moment it was the most welcome sight I'd ever seen. I approached the cabin, my flashlight beam dancing across its weathered wooden walls. The windows glowed with a warm, inviting light. I hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. There was a long pause, and then I heard shuffling from inside. The door creaked open, and I found myself face to face with an old man. He was tall and lean, with a long white beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. He didn't seem surprised to see me at all. "I've been expecting you, Sarah," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. I froze. How did he know my name? I hadn't told him. Before I could ask, he ushered me inside. The cabin was small but cozy, filled with old furniture and shelves lined with books and odd trinkets. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The old man gestured for me to sit in a worn armchair by the fire. As I sank into it, grateful for the warmth, he busied himself in the tiny kitchen area. "You must be hungry after your long hike," he said, his back to me. "I'll fix you something to eat." I wanted to ask how he knew I'd been hiking, how he knew my name, but my growling stomach overrode my curiosity. As he worked, the old man started talking, telling me about himself. He said his name was Ezra, and that he'd lived in these woods for decades. Hikers like yourself always seem to find me when they're lost. he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. It's been that way for years. As he set a bowl of hot stew in front of me, Ezra started asking me questions. At first, they seemed innocent enough, where I was from, what I did for a living. But then things took a strange turn. "How's your sister's new baby doing?" he asked casually. "Little Emma, right?" I nearly choked on my stew. My sister had given birth just 2 weeks ago, and we'd named the baby Emma after our grandmother. There was no way this stranger could know that. "And your job at the advertising firm in Charlotte? Still enjoying it?" My blood ran cold. I'd never mentioned anything about my job or where I lived. Ezra continued rattling off details about my life that he couldn't possibly know. My recent breakup, my childhood dog's name, even the fact that I'd twisted my ankle on a hike last month. I sat there frozen as he spoke. Part of me wanted to run, but another part was paralyzed with a mix of fear and fascination. How could he know all this? Was I dreaming? Had I hit my head on the trail and was now hallucinating? Ezra must have sensed my unease because he suddenly changed the subject, telling me stories about the mountains and the wildlife. His voice was hypnotic, and despite my fear, I found myself relaxing. Before I knew it, my eyelids were growing heavy. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the armchair. Sunlight was streaming through the cabin's dusty windows. Ezra was nowhere to be seen. I called out, but there was no answer. The fire had died down to embers and the cabin felt cold and empty. On a small table next to me, I found a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The trail is just beyond the big oak tree to the east. Safe travels, Sarah." Still groggy and confused, I gathered my things and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and the forest was alive with birdsong. I looked back at the cabin, half expecting it to have disappeared, but it was still there, silent and weathered. I found the oak tree Ezra had mentioned, and sure enough, there was the trail. Within an hour, I was back at the trailhead where I'd parked my car. As I drove home, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. A week later, I was unpacking my hiking gear when something fell out of my backpack. It was a small, leather-bound notebook I'd never seen before. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside were pages and pages of handwritten notes. Names, dates, personal details, information about dozens of hikers. Some entries were decades old, while others were recent. With growing horror, I realized that my own name was there, along with details of my life that I'd never shared with anyone. But what truly chilled me to the bone were the notes next to some of the names. Still missing. Never found. Search called off after 2 weeks. In a panic, I called the ranger station, babbling about Matthew's trail and the old man in the cabin. The ranger on the phone sounded confused. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "Matthew's trail has been closed for over 30 years. There are no cabins in that area. I've never gone back to those mountains. I've tried to convince myself that it was all some kind of elaborate hoax or a stress-induced hallucination. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about Ezra and that cabin in the woods, and I can't help but think about those other hikers, the ones who, unlike me, never made it back home, or made." I was desperate for work when I saw the ad for a night shift job at Parker's farm. The pay wasn't great, but beggars can't be choosers, right? I'd just moved to this small town in Iowa, trying to start fresh after a messy breakup left me nearly broke. The farm was about 20 minutes outside of town, and when I pulled up for my first shift, I was struck by how isolated it felt. The old farmhouse loomed in the darkness, its weathered boards barely visible in the dim light of the waning moon. Behind it stood a massive red barn, and further back, the hulking silhouette of a grain silo. Mr. Parker, a wiry man in his 60s with a permanent scowl, gave me a quick tour. My job was simple: sort corn in the barn, separating the good ears from the bad. He introduced me to the other night shift workers, 4 guys and 2 women, all looking as desperate for work as I was. The first few nights were uneventful. We worked in relative silence, the monotonous task of sorting corn broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside or the distant hoot of an owl. I got to know my co-workers a bit during our breaks. There was Mike, a former factory worker who'd lost his job when the plant closed down. Sarah, a single mom trying to make ends meet. And Tom, a college dropout who seemed to always be looking over his shoulder. It was during my second week that things started to get weird. I showed up for my shift and Sarah wasn't there. Mr. Parker said she'd quit, no explanation given. It seemed odd. She'd just been talking about how much she needed this job, but I shrugged it off and got to work. A few nights later, Mike was gone too. Again, Mr. Parker said he'd quit. This time I asked the others if they knew anything, but they all shook their heads, looking as confused as I felt. As the days passed, more workers disappeared. Tom, then the others whose names I barely had time to learn. Each time the same story from Mr. Parker. They'd quit, no notice given. By the end of the month, I was the only one left from the original crew. One night, about halfway through my shift, I needed to use the restroom. As I walked across the barn to the small bathroom in the corner, something caught my eye. Partially hidden behind some old farm equipment was a pile of belongings. A jacket I recognized as Mike's, Sarah's worn sneakers, Tom's backpack. It looked like they'd just vanished in the middle of work. My heart racing, I confronted Mr. Parker. He listened to my breathless explanation with that same impassive scowl, then calmly repeated what he'd said before. They'd quit, left in a hurry, probably forgot their stuff. But the look in his eyes, it was like he was daring me to challenge him. I thought about quitting right then and there, but the truth was I still needed the money. So I stayed, telling myself I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That's when I started noticing the noises. At first, it was just faint scratching sounds coming from the direction of the silo. I tried to convince myself it was just rats or the wind, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The sounds grew louder over the next few nights, evolving into a rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo across the empty fields. One particularly quiet night, I could have sworn I heard voices, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. They seemed to be coming from the silo, rising and falling in a strange, almost musical cadence. I stood frozen in the barn doorway, straining to make out words, but they always seemed just beyond my comprehension. I started dreading going to work. The once peaceful nights now felt oppressive, the darkness hiding untold horrors. But what scared me most were the footprints I found every morning as I was leaving. Fresh tracks in the dirt, leading from the silo to the barn, and then simply vanishing, as if whoever or whatever made them had just disappeared into thin air. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was Mr. Parker, checking on things before I left. But the prints were always fresh, the dirt still unsettled, and I never saw or heard him around at that time. Plus, there was something off about the shape of them. Too long, too narrow to be human feet. About 6 weeks into the job, things came to a head. The noises from the silo were louder than ever, a constant maddening rhythm that made it impossible to focus on my work. I kept glancing at the barn door, half expecting to see some nightmarish creature lumber in. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. In the pitch darkness, I heard the barn door creak open. The sound of shuffling footsteps, too many to count, filled the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized they were getting closer. I fumbled for my phone, finally managing to turn on the flashlight. The beam swept across the barn, illuminating piles of corn and old machinery. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A mass of writhing shapes, too many limbs moving in impossible ways. But when I swung the light back, there was nothing there. The lights came back on as suddenly as they'd gone out. The barn was empty, silent except for my ragged breathing. But there, on the floor, were dozens of fresh footprints, all leading towards the back of the barn where I'd found my co-workers' belongings. I didn't even bother to clock out. I just ran to my car and sped away, gravel spraying behind me as I tore down the long driveway. I called the sheriff the next day, babbling about missing co-workers and strange noises. They did a cursory check of the farm, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Mr. Parker told them the same story. The workers had quit, simple as that. I left town a week later, unable to shake the feeling that something horrible was happening at Parker's farm. Sometimes late at night I still hear those rhythmic thumps in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, checking my room for impossible footprints. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs as I strolled through the local fair, the scent of caramel apples and cinnamon wafting through the air. It was a tradition in our small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, to celebrate the harvest season with a weekend-long event filled with local vendors, carnival rides, and homemade treats. I'd been looking forward to this all year, a much-needed break from my monotonous office job. As I wandered past stalls selling handcrafted jewelry and homemade jams, I noticed an older man setting up a booth filled with antique mirrors. His weathered hands carefully arranged ornate frames of various sizes and styles. Something about him caught my attention. Perhaps it was the intensity in his eyes or the way he seemed to be watching me even as he worked. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and continued my exploration of the fair. But as I circled back around, I realized the mirror vendor had moved his stall. He was now directly in my path, his eyes locked on mine as I approached. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice gravelly and low. "I have something special for you." I politely smiled and prepared to decline, but his next words stopped me in my tracks. "I believe I have a mirror from your house. It would look perfect in your bathroom, right above that pedestal sink with the crack in the corner." My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know about the small crack in my bathroom sink? I'd only noticed it myself a few weeks ago and hadn't told anyone about it. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I managed to stammer out. The old man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your bathroom, the one with the light blue tiles and the small window that looks out onto the oak tree in your backyard. The mirror I have would fit perfectly on that wall." My heart was pounding in my chest. Every detail he mentioned was spot on. I'd never seen this man before in my life, and I certainly hadn't invited him into my home. "I think you must be mistaken," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know how you know those things, but I'm not interested in buying any mirrors today." I turned to leave, but the old man called after me. "You'll be back. They always come back." I practically ran from the fair, my earlier enjoyment completely forgotten. As I drove home, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a lucky guess, or perhaps someone I knew had mentioned my bathroom renovation to him. But deep down, I knew these explanations didn't add up. When I got home, I immediately went to my bathroom. Everything was exactly as it always had been. The light blue tiles, the small window overlooking the oak tree, the pedestal sink with its small crack. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I examined the mirror closely, looking for any signs of tampering or hidden cameras. Finding nothing, I decided I was just being paranoid and tried to put the strange encounter out of my mind. That night I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every creak of the house settling made me jump. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with distorted reflections and the old man's unsettling smile. The next morning I dragged myself out of bed exhausted. As I stumbled into the bathroom to splash some water on my face, something caught my eye. There, on the surface of the mirror, was a single, perfect fingerprint. It wasn't mine. I could tell by the size and pattern that it belonged to someone with much larger hands. I scrubbed the mirror clean, my mind racing. Had someone been in my house? But how? I always locked up carefully, and there were no signs of forced entry. I decided to chalk it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I'd touched the mirror with a greasy hand and just hadn't noticed. But the next morning, it happened again. Another fingerprint, in a different spot. And the morning after that, 3 more appeared. Each day I'd clean the mirror thoroughly before bed, and each morning I'd wake to find new prints. I was losing sleep, jumping at every sound in the night. I started avoiding looking in the mirror, afraid of what I might see. My coworkers commented on the dark circles under my eyes, but I brushed off their concerns. After a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the local electronics store and bought a small security camera. I set it up discreetly in the corner of my bathroom, angled to capture the mirror and the door. That night I barely slept, knowing that in the morning I'd finally have answers. As soon as the sun rose, I rushed to check the camera footage. My hands shook as I fast-forwarded through the night. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I saw movement. A figure entered the bathroom. It was dark, but I could make out the shape of a person, tall and thin. They moved directly to the mirror, their back to the camera. I watched in horror as they placed their hands on the glass, leaving behind the fingerprints I'd been finding every morning. But what happened next made my blood run cold. The figure turned, and for a brief moment their face was illuminated by a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. It was the old man from the fair. He looked directly at the camera and smiled that same unsettling smile. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Not through the door, not through the window. He simply vanished. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to find some logical explanation. But there was none. The old man had appeared in my locked bathroom in the middle of the night, left his fingerprints on my mirror, and disappeared into thin air. I packed a bag and left my house immediately, staying with a friend for a few days. When I finally worked up the courage to return home, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The mirror was clean with no sign of fingerprints. The security camera footage from the nights I was gone showed nothing but an empty bathroom. To this day, I still don't know how the old man got into my house or how he knew so much about my bathroom. I've since moved to a new apartment in a different city, but I can never shake the feeling that someday I'll turn around and see that unsettling smile reflected in my mirror once again. The late October chill seeped into my bones as I navigated the winding roads back home. It was just past midnight, and I was exhausted from a long day at work followed by drinks with colleagues. The fog had started rolling in about an hour into my drive, and now it was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead of me. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The headlights barely penetrated the soupy darkness, creating an eerie tunnel vision effect. I'd driven this route countless times, but tonight, every curve and dip in the road felt unfamiliar and threatening. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, my heart nearly stopped. There, on the side of the road, stood a figure, tall and lean, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, one arm outstretched with thumb raised in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. By the time my eyes refocused, the figure had vanished into the mist. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to fatigue and the tricky visibility. I turned up the radio, hoping the noise would keep me alert for the remaining 40 miles of my journey. About 10 minutes later, I nearly swerved off the road. There he was again, the same tall, lean figure, same dark hoodie, same outstretched arm. This time, I got a better look at his face, or rather, the lack of one. The hood cast such deep shadows that I couldn't make out any features. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I sped up, my mind racing. It had to be a coincidence, right? Just another hitchhiker in the same getup. But as the miles ticked by, that theory became harder to believe. Every few miles, there he was. Sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, but always the same. Tall, lean, hooded, faceless. By the fifth sighting, I was in a cold sweat. This was impossible. No one could move that fast, especially not in this fog. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a group of pranksters coordinating to scare drivers. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The posture, the build, the unsettling absence of a face. It was identical every time. I fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it in my panic. With shaking fingers, I dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline in the surreal nightmare I found myself in. 911, what's your emergency? I blurted out my story, aware of how crazy it sounded. There's a hitchhiker. I keep seeing him every few miles. It's impossible, he can't be real. I think I'm being followed or something. To her credit, the dispatcher took me seriously. She asked for my location and assured me they'd send a patrol car to check it out. She also advised me to keep driving and not to stop for any reason. I didn't need to be told twice. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my old Ford to its limits. The fog seemed to thicken with every mile, as if trying to hold me back. And still, he appeared. always just at the edge of my headlight's reach, always gone by the time I drew level. It was during one of these terrifying flybys that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. As I sped past, I caught a glimpse of something at the hitchhiker's feet. A large backpack and what looked like a rolled-up sleeping bag. My mind flashed back to the previous week. I'd come home from work to find my garage door slightly ajar. At first, I thought I'd just forgotten to close it properly that morning. But then I noticed some things were missing. My camping gear, including my heavy-duty backpack and sleeping bag. I'd filed a police report, but in our small town, petty theft wasn't exactly a high priority. I'd written it off as bad luck and planned to replace the items come spring. Now, seeing that gear at the feet of this impossible, haunting figure, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just some random creepy encounter. This thing, whatever it was, had been to my home, had taken my things, had perhaps been watching me, waiting for this night, this fog, this lonely stretch of road. I was so lost in this horrifying realization that I almost missed the flashing lights up ahead. A wave of relief washed over me as I recognized a police cruiser parked on the shoulder. I pulled up behind it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the car in park. An officer approached my window, flashlight in hand. I rolled down the window, words tumbling out of my mouth in a frantic jumble. The officer listened patiently, then asked me to stay in the car while he and his partner investigated. I watched in the rearview mirror as the two officers disappeared into the fog, their flashlight beams swallowed by the mist. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slow. I jumped at every sound, the tick of cooling metal, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes, the officers returned. They'd found something, but it wasn't what I expected. About a quarter-mile down the road, just off the shoulder, they'd discovered a small campsite. There was a tent, a backpack, and a sleeping bag. Items that matched the description of what had been stolen from my garage. But here's the strange thing, the officer said, his brow furrowed. The gear's covered in mud, but it's not the kind of mud we have around here. It's darker, almost reddish, and there's a smell. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. Like wet leaves and copper, I finished for him. The officer nodded, looking unsettled for the first time. Exactly. We've called for backup to process the scene properly. In the meantime, I'd like you to follow us to the station to give a full statement. As I trailed behind the police cruiser, my mind was reeling. The gear, the mud, the smell. It all felt wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. And the hitchhiker? Where had he gone? Had he ever really been there at all? The fog began to lift as we neared town, and by the time we reached the police station, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I gave my statement, my voice hoarse from repeating the bizarre tale. They never found the hitchhiker. The camping gear was logged into evidence, but forensics couldn't explain the strange mud or the lingering metallic scent. Eventually, the case went cold, filed away as just another unsolved mystery. I still drive that road sometimes, always in broad daylight now. I've never seen the hitchhiker again, but every time the fog rolls in, I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, thumb outstretched, waiting for someone to stop. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch a whiff of something that makes me shiver. The scent of wet leaves and copper, a reminder of that impossible, terrifying night. It was late October, and the crisp autumn air had already started to bite. Living in a small town in upstate New York, I knew winter was just around the corner. As a homeowner, there's always a list of chores to tackle before the snow starts falling, and cleaning the gutters was at the top of mine. I woke up early on a Saturday morning, determined to get it done. As I dragged the ladder out of the garage, I couldn't shake off this weird feeling that had been nagging at me for the past few days. It was like someone was watching me, but every time I looked around, there was no one there. Climbing up the ladder, I started scooping out leaves and debris from the gutters. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a small toy car lodged in there, the exact same model my son had lost months ago. We'd torn the house apart looking for it, and now here it was, sitting in our gutter like it had been there all along. I pocketed the toy, making a mental note to show it to my wife later. As I continued working my way around the house, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time I finished cleaning the gutters, I was thoroughly unsettled. I headed inside ready for a hot shower and a cold beer. But as I walked into the kitchen, I froze. The fridge door was covered in photos of me cleaning the gutters. They were taken from different angles, some from across the street, others from our backyard. My hands shook as I tore them down, my mind racing. Who could have done this? How did they get into our house? I called the police, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry. They suggested it might be a prank, but something in my gut told me it was more than that. Over the next few days, more strange things started happening. I'd come home to find my favorite mug in a different cupboard, or my shoes rearranged in the closet. Small things only someone who knew our habits would notice. That's when I started thinking about our old neighbor, Mike. He'd moved away suddenly about a month ago. No goodbye, no forwarding address. We'd been pretty close. He'd often come over for beers and watch the game. He knew our routines, knew where we kept the spare key. But why would he do this? A week after the gutter incident, I was up late watching TV when I saw it for the first time. A shadow moving across our backyard. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shadow started appearing more frequently. I'd see it out of the corner of my eye while doing dishes, or reflected in the TV screen late at night. Sometimes it seemed to be watching me from just outside the window. Other times it would dart across the room when I turned my back. I started losing sleep, jumping at every little noise. My wife thought I was losing it. She hadn't noticed anything strange, hadn't seen the shadow. I started to wonder if I was going crazy. Maybe the stress of work was finally getting to me. But then came the night that changed everything. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps downstairs. My wife was fast asleep beside me. Heart pounding, I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and crept down the stairs. The living room was dark, but I could make out a figure standing by the window. As I flipped on the light, ready to confront the intruder, I gasped. It was Mike. But something was off. His eyes were glazed over and he had this eerie smile on his face. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "Miss me?" I stood there frozen, as Mike casually walked around the room, touching things, picking up photos. He talked about how he'd been watching us, how he knew everything we'd been doing. He spoke about our family like they were his own, referring to my wife and kids by pet names I'd never heard before. When I finally found my voice, I asked him why he was doing this. His response chilled me to the bone. "Because you're living my life," he said, his eyes suddenly clear and filled with a cold rage. "This is my house, my family. You stole them from me." I tried to reason with him, told him he was confused, that he needed help, but he just laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. I blinked, and he vanished into thin air. I searched the entire house, but there was no trace of him. The police came again, but like before, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence that Mike had ever been there. They suggested I install security cameras, get some rest, see a therapist. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. The shadow never appeared again after that night. The strange occurrences stopped. It was like Mike had simply ceased to exist. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Was Mike real? Was he a ghost? Or was it all in my mind? I still clean the gutters every fall, but now I do it with a sense of dread. Every time I climb that ladder, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching me. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of a familiar shadow out of the corner of my eye. I needed some extra cash for the holidays, so when I saw an ad for seasonal work at a local farm, I jumped at the opportunity. It was a night security gig, which suited me fine. I've always been a bit of a night owl anyway. The farm was about 20 miles outside of town, nestled in the heart of corn country. When I arrived for my first shift, the owner, Mr. Johnson, gave me a quick tour. "It's pretty straightforward," he said, gesturing to the vast expanse of cornfields surrounding us. "Just patrol the perimeter every couple of hours, make sure no one's trying to steal our crops or equipment. We've had some issues with vandals lately." He handed me a flashlight and a walkie-talkie. "If you see anything suspicious, radio in, but it's usually quiet out here." As Mr. Johnson walked away, I couldn't help but notice the dozens of scarecrows dotting the fields. They were your typical straw-stuffed figures, dressed in old flannel shirts and jeans with burlap sack heads. Nothing out of the ordinary, but something about their blank faces made me uneasy. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds, check the equipment sheds, and then hunker down in the small guard shack near the main barn. It was boring work, but easy money. I'd usually pass the time reading or playing games on my phone. It was during my fourth shift that I first noticed something odd. As I made my 2 a.m. round, I could have sworn one of the scarecrows had moved. Not dramatically, mind you. It was just slightly off from where I remembered it being earlier. I shook my head, chalking it up to my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, the changes were subtle. A scarecrow's arm raised a little higher. Another's head tilted at a different angle. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe I was just misremembering their positions. But deep down, a growing sense of unease was taking root. I didn't mention it to Mr. Johnson. I mean, how could I without sounding crazy? "Hey boss, I think your scarecrows are moving around at night." Yeah, that would go over well. About a week into the job, I was making my usual rounds when something caught my eye. There, stuck in one of the scarecrow's outstretched hands, was a small square of paper. Curious, I plucked it out and shone my flashlight on it. My blood ran cold. It was a Polaroid photo of me, sleeping in the guard shack. The image was grainy and a bit out of focus, but there was no mistaking my slumped form in the chair, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. What made it truly terrifying was the angle. This photo had been taken from outside the shack through the window. I spun around, my heart pounding, scanning the dark fields with my flashlight. But there was nothing. Just rows of corn and those damn scarecrows, standing silently in the night. I spent the rest of that shift on high alert, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I seriously considered quitting. But I needed the money, and a part of me was determined to figure out what the hell was going on. The next night I came prepared. I brought a thermos of strong coffee to keep me awake and a small camera of my own. I was going to catch whoever was messing with me. As I approached the guard shack for my shift, I noticed something odd on the ground. Fresh straw was scattered near the door. I crouched down to examine it and felt my stomach drop. There were footprints. Not shoe prints, but distinct impressions that looked like feet made of straw. The prints led from the shack towards the cornfield. With shaking hands, I radioed Mr. Johnson. "There's someone here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've found footprints." There was a long pause before he responded. "That's impossible. You're the only one scheduled tonight." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him about the photo, the moving scarecrows, everything. But before I could, I heard a rustling from the cornfield. I swung my flashlight towards the sound, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a figure duck behind the rows of corn. A figure wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. "I'm coming out there," Mr. Johnson's voice crackled over the radio. "Don't do anything stupid." I waited by the guard shack, every muscle in my body tense. The corn swayed gently in the breeze, and shadows danced at the edge of my flashlight beam. It felt like hours before I finally saw headlights approaching. Mr. Johnson's truck pulled up, and he climbed out, looking annoyed. "All right, show me these footprints." But when I led him to where I'd seen them, they were gone. The straw was still there, but the distinct impressions had vanished. Mr. Johnson gave me a long, hard look. "Look, son," he said, his voice a mix of concern and frustration. I know night shifts can play tricks on your mind if you're not cut out for this. I'm fine, I interrupted, even though I was far from it. It must have been an animal or something. Sorry for the false alarm. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. As he drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of that night passed without incident, but I couldn't relax. Every time I looked out at the fields, the scarecrows seemed to be watching me, their burlap faces mocking my fear. When my shift ended, I made a decision. I couldn't do this anymore. The money wasn't worth whatever this was. I left a note for Mr. Johnson in the guard shack, apologizing and explaining that I had to quit. As I walked to my car, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, I took one last look at the cornfields. In the early morning light, everything looked normal. The scarecrow stood motionless, nothing more than harmless straw men. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. One of the scarecrows, far out in the field, lifted its arm and waved. I didn't wait around to see more. I jumped in my car and sped away, gravel spraying behind me. I never went back to that farm, and I never took another night security job. Sometimes, when I drive past cornfields, I can't help but look at the scarecrows and wonder. But I tell myself it was all in my head. It had to be, because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. The annual neighborhood gathering was always the highlight of our summer in Oakwood, a quiet suburb just outside of Columbus, Ohio. It was a tradition that had been going strong for over 2 decades, bringing together families who'd known each other for years. This year, however, things were different. We had some new faces in the crowd, the Millers, who had moved in just a month ago. I remember the day vividly. It was a warm Saturday evening in late July. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue and the sound of children laughing. As usual, I was manning the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs while chatting with my longtime neighbor, Tom. That's when Sarah Miller approached, holding a large glass pitcher filled with what looked like apple cider. "I hope you don't mind," she said with a warm smile, "but we brought some homemade cider. It's an old family recipe." Of course, we didn't mind. In fact, we were thrilled. It was always nice when newcomers made an effort to contribute. I watched as Sarah made her way around, offering the cider to everyone. The amber liquid looked refreshing in the summer heat, and soon enough, most of the adults had a cup in hand. I took a sip of mine and immediately noticed something off. It wasn't bad per se, just different. There was an underlying bitterness that I couldn't quite place, but I didn't want to be rude, so I kept drinking, assuming it was just an acquired taste. As the evening wore on, I started to feel strange. At first, I thought it was just the heat getting to me. My vision began to blur slightly, and my limbs felt heavy. I looked around and noticed others seemed to be experiencing the same thing. Mrs. Johnson from across the street was swaying slightly as she spoke, and Mr. Peterson had dozed off in his lawn chair, something he'd never done before at these gatherings. The last thing I remember clearly was checking my watch. It was just past 9 p.m. After that, everything becomes a haze of disjointed images and sensations. I recall the sound of distant laughter, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, and an overwhelming urge to close my eyes. When I finally came to, the world around me had changed dramatically. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Gone were the sounds of conversation and laughter. Instead, there was an eerie stillness broken only by the soft crackle of the dying fire. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision and make sense of what I was seeing. The backyard was empty, completely empty. But that couldn't be right. There had been over 30 people here just how long ago? I fumbled for my phone and was shocked to see it was 3:27 a.m. I'd been out for over 6 hours. Panic started to set in as I stumbled to my feet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. No response. I made my way to the front of the house, hoping to see people leaving, cars pulling out of driveways. But what I saw only confused me more. Every single car that had been there earlier was still parked along the street, including mine. My heart was pounding now. Where was everyone? I pulled out my phone again, ready to call 911, when something caught my eye. A faint glint in the bushes near my driveway. I approached cautiously and reached in, my hand closing around something solid and rectangular. A camcorder. With shaking hands, I opened the viewfinder and pressed play. The footage started normally enough. Scenes from our gathering, people laughing and talking. But then things took a dark turn. I watched in horror as one by one, people began to slump over in their chairs or collapse onto the grass. And then, movement. Dark figures, their faces obscured, began to emerge from the shadows at the edge of the yard. They moved with purpose, grabbing the unconscious bodies of my neighbors and dragging them towards the woods behind my house. I dropped the camcorder and ran to the tree line, shouting names, searching desperately for any sign of where they might have gone. But there was nothing. No trail, no evidence of anyone having passed through. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes and I babbled out my story, showing them the camcorder. They searched the woods, brought in dogs, even used thermal imaging. Nothing. It was as if everyone had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation that followed was intense but ultimately fruitless. The Miller's house was empty, cleared out as if they'd never been there. The cider was tested but showed no signs of any known drug or poison. People from neighboring towns were brought in to search, but not a single body was found. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Life in Oakwood changed irrevocably. Those of us who remained, mostly people who hadn't attended the gathering, lived in a state of constant fear and suspicion. The case made national news. Theories abounded, but no concrete answers ever surfaced. As for me, I couldn't bring myself to leave. This was my home, and somehow, I felt responsible. I needed to be here when my neighbors returned. But things haven't been the same since that night. I keep smelling smoke, even when there's no fire burning. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear whispers outside my window. Familiar voices calling out names I recognize. The police have stopped actively investigating, but I know something happened that night. Something inexplicable. And as much as it terrifies me, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That someday, somehow, I'll find out the truth about what happened to my neighbors on that warm July evening. I've always been the type of person who tries to help out where I can. Growing up in a small town in upstate New York, it was just how things were done. So when I moved into my new neighborhood in the suburbs of Buffalo last fall, I was eager to make a good impression and lend a hand to my neighbors. The leaves were just starting to turn when I first met Mrs. Abernathy. She lived in the pale yellow house 2 doors down. A sweet-looking old lady with wispy white hair and glasses that magnified her pale blue eyes. I'd see her out tending to her garden most days, always wearing a floral apron and humming to herself. One chilly October afternoon, I was raking leaves in my own yard when Mrs. Abernathy shuffled over, leaning on her cane. She complimented my yard work and mentioned how difficult it was for her to keep up with the falling leaves these days. Without hesitation, I offered to help her out. "Oh, you're such a dear," she said, patting my arm. "Why don't you come by this weekend? I'll have some of my famous pumpkin bread ready as a thank you." That Saturday, I headed over to Mrs. Abernathy's house, rake in hand. The air was crisp and the scent of wood smoke hung in the air. Her yard was sizable, with several large maple trees that had shed most of their leaves. Mrs. Abernathy greeted me from her porch, a plate of pumpkin bread in her hands. "Help yourself, dear," she said, gesturing to the bread. "And don't worry about bagging the leaves. Just rake them into a pile near the back fence. They make wonderful mulch for my garden." I took a piece of the bread. It was delicious, moist with just the right amount of spice, and got to work. The day was pleasant, and I found myself enjoying the repetitive motion of raking. Mrs. Abernathy sat on her porch, knitting and occasionally calling out words of encouragement. It wasn't until I'd been working for about an hour that things started to feel off. I'd gathered a sizable pile of leaves near the back fence when my rake hit something solid. Thinking it was probably a rock, I bent down to move it. That's when I saw it. Nestled among the brown and orange leaves was something small, white, and unmistakably tooth-shaped. My stomach lurched. I told myself it had to be something else, maybe an oddly shaped pebble or a piece of shell from Mrs. Abernathy's garden decorations. But deep down, I knew what it was. With trembling hands, I pushed more leaves aside. Another tooth appeared, and another. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I glanced back at the house, but Mrs. Abernathy seemed absorbed in her knitting, oblivious to my discovery. I should have stopped there, should have made an excuse and left, called the police. But a morbid curiosity took hold of me. I had to know. Using the rake, I carefully scraped away more leaves. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet odor of decay that reminded me of the time I'd forgotten a pumpkin on my porch until spring. As more leaves fell away, I saw it, unmistakably human fingers poking through the soil. I stumbled back, the rake clattering to the ground. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I felt eyes on me. I turned to see Mrs. Abernathy standing on her porch watching me. The kind smile I'd grown accustomed to was still there, but now it seemed wrong somehow, too wide, too knowing. "Everything all right, dear?" she called out, her voice as sweet as ever. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Mrs. Abernathy made her way down the porch steps, moving with more agility than I'd ever seen from her. "Oh, I see you've discovered my little secret," she said, her tone conversational as if we were discussing the weather. "My special fertilizer. Works wonders for the garden, doesn't it?" I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Mrs. Abernathy was standing next to me now, looking down at the partially uncovered hand with something like pride. "Now, don't you worry your pretty little head about this," she said, patting my cheek with a hand that felt ice cold. "Why don't you head on home? I'll finish up here." My body finally responded to my brain's frantic signals. I backed away, then turned and ran, not stopping until I was safely inside my own house, doors locked behind me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was an elaborate Halloween prank. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those fingers poking through the earth, heard Mrs. Abernathy's cheerful voice talking about special fertilizer. As night fell, I forced myself to look out my window towards Mrs. Abernathy's house. Everything looked normal. The leaf pile I'd been working on was gone, the yard neat and tidy. I could see Mrs. Abernathy through her kitchen window, baking something. She looked up as if sensing my gaze and waved cheerfully. I let the curtain fall back into place, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But what would I tell them? That my sweet old neighbor might be hiding bodies in her yard? That she'd talked about using them as fertilizer? It sounded insane even to me. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, plagued by nightmares of hands reaching up through piles of leaves. When morning finally came, I decided I needed some fresh air to clear my head. As soon as I opened my front door, I froze. My yard, which had been clear the day before, was covered in a thick layer of leaves. Red, orange, and brown, they carpeted the grass completely. But that was impossible. I didn't have any trees in my yard that could have shed so many leaves overnight. With a growing sense of dread, I stepped off my porch. The leaves crunched under my feet, releasing that same sickly sweet smell I'd encountered in Mrs. Abernathy's yard. I looked down and saw something poking out from beneath the leaves. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached down and picked it up. It was my rake, the one I'd left behind in my panic the day before. I dropped the rake like it had burned me and stumbled back towards my house. As I reached for the door handle, movement caught my eye. There was Mrs. Abernathy, standing at the edge of my property. She smiled and waved, holding up a freshly baked pie. "Good morning, dear," she called out. "I brought you a little thank you for your help yesterday. It's my special recipe." I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. Through the window I could still see Mrs. Abernathy standing there, pie in hand, that too wide smile still on her face. The leaves in my yard rustled in a breeze I couldn't feel, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving beneath them. I don't know what to do now. I can't prove anything, and who would believe me anyway? All I know is that I won't be helping any neighbors with their yard work again. And I certainly won't be eating any of Mrs. Abernathy's baked goods. As for the leaves in my yard, well, I think I'll just let them be. Who knows what I might find if I start raking. It was just another Friday night, and I was heading home from a late shift at the hospital. I'm a nurse, and these long hours are part of the job. Usually I take the highway, but that night, my GPS alerted me to a major pileup ahead. It suggested an alternate route through some back roads I'd never taken before. I didn't think much of it at first. The roads were empty, and I was looking forward to getting home and falling into bed. But as I turned onto the first unfamiliar street, a thick fog started rolling in. It wasn't unusual for our area, especially in the fall, but something about it felt different that night. The fog got denser as I drove deeper into the countryside. My headlights barely penetrated the murky white wall in front of me. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my eyes straining to make out the road ahead. That's when I saw it. A car on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly through the fog. As I approached, I could make out a figure waving frantically. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, looking distressed. For a split second, I considered stopping. It's what any decent person would do, right? But something held me back. Maybe it was the late hour, or the eerie fog, or just my exhaustion from the long shift. Whatever it was, I drove past, watching the woman's figure disappear in my rearview mirror. I felt a twinge of guilt but pushed it aside. She probably had a cell phone. Someone else would stop. I just wanted to get home. About 10 minutes later, I saw another car on the roadside. Same model, same hazard lights. This time it was a man waving for help. My heart started racing. It couldn't be the same car, could it? I was miles from where I'd seen the first one. I sped up, a chill running down my spine. As I continued driving, it happened again. And again. The same car, different spots along the road, always with someone desperately trying to flag me down. Sometimes it was the woman, sometimes the man, once even a teenager. Each time I drove past, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was some kind of car club meeting, and these were all similar models having trouble in the fog. But deep down, I knew that explanation didn't make sense. The fog was so thick. How were they moving the car without me noticing? At one point, I could have sworn I saw two of the cars at once, one on each side of the road. I blinked, and when I looked again, there was only one. I was starting to question my sanity. The GPS kept recalculating, taking me deeper into the maze of back roads. I wanted to turn around, to go back to the highway regardless of the accident. But I was so turned around that I wasn't sure which way would lead me back. Then came the moment that still haunts me. I was driving past yet another iteration of the mysterious car, when suddenly, my own car lurched violently. There was a sickening thud, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd hit something, or someone. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, engine idling, too scared to get out and check. The fog swirled around my car, and in the rearview mirror, I could see nothing but a wall of white. Finally, gathering my courage, I stepped out. The cold air hit me like a slap. I walked around my car, inspecting it closely. There was no damage, no sign of impact. But as I reached the passenger side, I froze. Long, deep scratches ran along the side of my car, as if something or someone had dragged their nails across it. I jumped back into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I drove the rest of the way home in a panic, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see one of those cars materialize behind me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I nearly cried with relief. I ran inside, double-checked all the locks, and tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was just my imagination, the fog playing tricks on me. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly inexplicable had happened out there. The next morning, I woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream, but the scratches on my car were still there, a tangible reminder of the night's events. As I sipped my coffee, trying to make sense of it all, a news alert popped up on my phone. My blood ran cold as I read the headline, "Multiple disappearances reported on county backroads." The article detailed a series of incidents where drivers had gone missing after reportedly stopping to help stranded motorists. The description of the stranded car matched exactly what I had seen, multiple times, the night before. I sat there, stunned, as the realization washed over me. Whatever had been out there in the fog, whatever had been trying to lure me to stop, I had narrowly escaped it. The scratches on my car suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. Had something tried to get in? In the days that followed, I gave a statement to the police, but I could tell they didn't quite believe me. How could the same car be in multiple places? How could I explain the scratches? Even I wasn't sure I believed what had happened. I've taken to avoiding back roads altogether now, sticking to well-lit, busy streets, even if it means a longer commute. I can't shake the feeling that if I venture onto those quiet roads again, especially on a foggy night, I might not be so lucky. Whatever's out there, waiting in the mist, might just catch up to me. The incident has faded into the background of my life now. But every now and then, when I'm driving at night and see a car pulled over on the side of the road, I feel that same chill run down my spine. And I keep driving, never stopping, always wondering about that night and the narrow escape I can't quite explain. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.